Welcome everyone to the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, California. It is such an honor to be here to introduce this amazing artist. My name is Catherine Opie and I'm a professor of art at UCLA. Tonight's presentation is part of a series of artist talks presented by the UCLA Department of Art, and I'm honored to introduce Winter Art Council Chair and a UCLA alum at that, Wendy Red Star. As a land-grant institution, the arts at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as their traditional land caretakers of Tongva Guard, Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. Since graduating UCLA with an MFA, Wendy Red Star has been transformational in continuing her work as she thoughtfully deconstructs to explore the intersections of a Native American ideologies and colonialism's unsettling effect on past and present. Wendy Red Star was raised on the Apsáalooke Crow Reservation in Montana. Her work is informed both by her cultural heritage and her engagement with many forms of creative expressions, including photography, sculpture, video, fiber arts, and performance. She is an avid researcher of archives and historical narratives. It could be negatives too. So historical narratives. Red Star seeks to incorporate and recast her research, offering new and unexpected perspectives in work that is at once inquisitive, witty, and unsettling. She has had solo exhibitions at Mass MoCA, the Newark Museum in New Jersey, the Duluth Art Institute, the Portland Art Museum, the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art, among others. She has won numerous awards, such as the Joan Mitchell Foundation grant, a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, a Haley Ford Fellow of the Ford Family Foundation, and many, many others. Her work is held in collections such as the Library of Congress, the Denver Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the St. Louis Art Museum. And again, this is just a few among a lot. Really importantly, recently, one of my favorite magazines, she edited Aperture Magazine's Fall 2020 in an issue called Native America. Wendy Red Star lives and works in Portland, Oregon, and we are so fortunate that she has agreed to come back to her alma mater, UCLA, and give this lecture tonight. I also read just last night on the internet, in terms of doing a little bit of research, that she's also one of the top 10 artists to watch out for in 2021. So without further ado, I give you a big hug. I wish the pink curtains were behind you, and welcome, and take it away.
Thank you, Kathy, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank the Hammer Art Museum for their wonderful support to get this lecture up and running. I would like to thank Candace Lynn for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. And as an alum of the UCLA Art Department, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of my professors who mentored me through my graduate education: Jennifer Belandi, Joel Otterson, the late Don Suggs, Nancy Rubens. I'd also like to thank Kathy Opie. Even though I didn't study under Kathy, the photo department and the students in the photo department really showed me the power of the photographic medium, which I utilize greatly in my art practice. So let's get started. I want to lay a foundation before we began. And this foundation is the main sort of source for the inspiration behind all the work that I create. And that is where I come from, the community that I'm from, the culture that I grew up in, the land that molded my experience. I'm a member of the Apsáalooke Nation, also known as the Crow Nation. And we are located in the state of Montana. Around the mid-1800s, the US government recorded our land holdings to be 38.5 million acres. And throughout treaty negotiations with the US government, our current reservation, which we're looking at now, is about 2.25 million acres. So quite a reduction in our land base. Our land base historically also dipped into what is now known as the state of Wyoming. So the reservation is split into 6 different distinct districts: the Pryor, Bighorn, Black Lodge, Reno, Lodgegrass, and Wyola. And each of those districts have a town that is associated with them. I grew up mainly in the town of Pryor and Pryor District, but I also spent time in Hardin, which is a border town located at the top of our reservation, just a few miles away from the reservation boundary. It once was part of our reservation, but our boundary shifted. And this is where I got my public education. I attended school with Crow kids, White Rancher kids, and mixed kids like myself. My mother is white. Another area I want to point out is the town of Crow Agency. And historically, well, I guess I would say every reservation has an agency. And that is where the US government historically placed a government worker known as the Indian agent, who resided over all the business activities and kept tabs on the native people who resided in the reservation. So Crow Agency still has government buildings. There's an Indian Health Service, and that is where my mother was a public health nurse for over 30 years. There is also the Little Bighorn College, and then an important event that's been happening in our community since 1904 happens in Crow Agency called Crow Fair, which I will go over in a little bit. So this is a Google map image of the land in which my family owns in the Pryor district. And this is the property that I grew up in. My father, when he was in his 40s, took this land out of lease, and it was leased by a white family for over 50 years. And when he took it out of lease, he created a ranch and farmed the land. And this was pretty much my playground. This is where I rode my horses. We had a great little horse herd, and my father tended to the land. And I spent a lot of time out in nature. My father still resides there. The yellow spot is specifically where he lives within that property. And when I return there, I often take really long walks. So this is an image of sort of the back end of that property. And there's this quote by our last official chief. His name was Chief Pleniku. And he says, "The ground on which we stand is sacred ground. It is the dust and blood of our ancestors." And that is the sense that I get when I'm out on the land. Just knowing that this land holds so much information, so much history. It is the land that shaped our language and our culture. And that is something that is deeply rooted within me, and a deep source inspiration for the work that I create. That cultural event that I want to talk about that happens in Crow Agency, is called Crow Fair. It's known as the teepee capital of the world, and it's been happening since 1904. This next slide shows an aerial view of the campgrounds, and then also a map of the campgrounds. The image, I think, was taken around the 90s, so it's not quite what it looks like today, but pretty similar. And the history behind Crow Fair was that it was started in 1904 by the Indian agent, and he wanted to figure out a way to get crows to assimilate into a farming lifestyle. Basically, he wanted a way to sort of encourage Crow people to start farming and introduce them or civilize them more into Western culture. So he created this fair that was modeled after the Midwest fairs that were popular around that time period, in hopes that the crows would bring their produce and their finest livestock, and the women would create canned goods and baked goods and crafts, and then they would receive awards for that. But knowing the community and knowing that that wouldn't be a very interesting or an engaging activity, he decided to lift some of the restrictions that were happening to my community, and frankly to all Native communities around that time, which was anything that promoted culture. And by lifting those restrictions, my community was able to include dancing. So you'll notice that circular structure in the photo and on the map, that is the dance arbor. So that is where the powwow takes place, and it's basically the sort of the hub or the main hub of this cultural event that people tend to go there and then disperse out into other parts of Crow Fair. So that was one of the activities that we brought to this fair. And then the other thing that we did was we created a parade. And this parade was very important to my ancestors because it allowed us to wear our clothing, and it allowed the women to bead and create outfits for their family, and also allowed us to show off our horses. We were notorious for having a lot of horses. And so this parade happens consecutively over 4 days every morning. And you'll notice around the dance arbor, there's a loop if you look at the map, and the parade happens around that loop every morning. Some other activities that happen now is a rodeo. There's a rodeo, and there's also some sort of side activities like a marathon and random things like boxing. So Crow Fair has been happening for over 100 years. And unfortunately, we weren't able to hold Crow Fair last August due to the pandemic. Every family sets up a camp. And so we pitch our teepees and we camp there. And it's also open to the public. So it's a big tourist draw, and it's open to other tribal communities. And they often participate in the powwow. There's drum groups from across the country, and even including Canada. So Crow Fair, as a child, is a very magical event. This is a photo of me at Crow Fair, and I just have some of my best memories from attending Crow Fair and riding my horses all day, going to the dance arbor and dancing. The dance arbor also has all these vendors where you can get great food and purchase things. So it was just like this great event and perfect for the future generations to really engage. And you can tell how impactful this event was because these are some of my childhood drawings from that time period. And now as an adult, it's an opportunity for me to engage my child in the culture. So this is us after one of the parades in the press. And this is what our family camp looks like. So we had the teepees on the side, and the structure that you're seeing on the right is actually where we cook. And it's the basically the place where the family has a conversation about what we're going to do next or any updates that are happening. And every family has a camp similar to this. I want to show 2 videos. The video on the right is my family's float on their way to enter into the parade, and the video on the left, and the video on the right is the parade in action. Yeah, you girls watch those feathers up there, okay?
Is my shawl touching the ground?
Nope, you guys are all good in front. Yep, you guys are good. And this is a photo of my daughter just right after the parade, parading on my father's horse. His name is Bubba. And around World War II, the government lost interest in Crow Fair, but our community didn't. And we basically took over this cultural event. And it's what I would consider like a revival, a cultural revival that happens every year, a chance to deeply immerse ourselves in the culture and participate in the culture. So it's really kind of flipped into this assimilation by this Indian agent to assimilate into Western culture. But now it's sort of a rejuvenation for us as a community to retain our culture. This is an image of my daughter and I getting ready to attend the grand entry at the powwow. And this gives you an idea of what the powwow looks like. This next video is a drum group. They're a Crow drum group called Nighthawk Juniors. And as I mentioned, the powwow is an intertribal event where other tribes attend and other drum groups attend. And it's actually one of my favorite things to do if I'm not dancing in the powwow is to stand behind the drum groups and watch them orchestrate their music. And it really gives you a great sense of the spirit of this cultural event. And now that I've given you a bit of context for the inspiration behind my work, let's talk about some of my work. A few years ago, I had an exhibition at the Q Foundation, which is an incredible resource for artists and curators. You can apply as an artist to have an exhibition, or if you are a curator, you can apply to curate a show in their exhibition space in Chelsea. And so for this exhibition, I wanted to focus on Crow Fair and create a timeline throughout the decades of Crow Fair. Umbucksbalia, please forgive me, I'm not a Crow speaker, but that is what we call Crow Fair. And the literal translation of that word is where they make the noise, which is really beautiful. And Crow Fair is sort of a delight of different sounds. So this is the space at Q. And so my idea behind this exhibition was to create a timeline utilizing different photo archives that documented Crow Fair throughout the decades. Starting first with my own personal photographs to my family's archive of images, and then dipping into historical archives and museum collection archives, photo archives. And so basically I would hunt down various images that I could find that related to Crow Fair, and then print those and painstakingly cut those out to map out this timeline. And then the other part of this timeline is I would write directly on the wall different information that I found kind of to be engaging or to illustrate certain objects and the uses. And also if I knew names of individuals, I would write down their name, like Singing Weasel. And then you may have noticed Crow women, our traditional dress is the elk tooth dress. And the elk tooth dress is decorated with beautiful eye teeth of an elk. And it represents, the eye teeth represent the hunting abilities or trading abilities of the men in that family. So it's a status symbol. But nowadays, most of these teeth are synthetic. And around the 1900s, they started to carve teeth out of bone or wood, but they still hold that symbolic meaning. This is a little snippet from the 1920s, and my grandmother is there in the elk tooth dress. Her name is Amy Bright Wings Red Star, and she was born in June in 1920. So my grandfather was born in 1907, and their whole lives, Crow Fair was happening, including my father's generation. And for me, Crow Fair seemed like it happened since the dawn of time. This is the 1990s. There are a ton of photos of me in the 90s. And this is the 80s, and then it dips into the 70s and 60s. Those smaller images you see are photos that my dad took, and they were slides originally. This is in the 2000s, and my daughter. I also like to think about the photo technology. So where I start the timeline, which is in 2016, it's, iPhones and digital cameras. And then it dips into black and white sepia toned images, which are film. But I also like to think about the photographers. So most of the colored images are photos taken by crows of crows. And then the black and white and sepia tones are white men taking photos of crows, except for one notable photographer named Richard Thrussell, who was half Cree and half Scottish. And he came to our reservation to work for the government, but became adopted by our community and developed a passion for photography and took some of my favorite images of my community. I'm gonna It's a little tiny video, but it's pretty grainy. So I'm not gonna play it, but I wanted to play parts of it. Oh, let me do this real quick. So I'm gonna pause right here. And the reason why I'm pausing is because I want to talk about this woman. Her name's Winona Pleniku. And the reason why I selected this particular image, because she's dressed in this old style way. And when I say old style, it's a type of dress that women and men of this certain generation, which would be my grandma's generation, would wear simple cloth dresses. They made their own high top leather moccasins. They also wore these leather tooled belts, and they would wear a scarf on their head or around their neck, and often carried a shawl or a blanket. And growing up, I used to see these women all the time. We call them kales, that's the Crow word for grandma. But now no one dresses like that. So my daughter's never seen anyone dress in this style. And then the other reason I wanted to show Winona is because she actually pops up in the timeline again. Let me start here. So this is the 1910s. Oh, I'm sorry. Right here. And she's that second littlest girl right here with her family, May Old Coyote, Susie Childs, Amy Whiteman runs him, and Agnes Deernose. And this was one of the amazing things that you could only experience by having this timeline depicted in space. It was an opportunity for me to sort of crisscross across the gallery and pick out individuals who popped up in various decades and revisit them as a child or as an elderly woman. And the other thing that this timeline gave me was hope. It gave me hope in that our culture is strong, and seeing that we still utilize and participate in some of the same cultural events and use the same cultural items in the 2000s just brought me a lot of joy. So it was really kind of a wonderful immersive experience to be able to visualize this epic event in history through this timeline. And like I said, I started the timeline in 2016. And my daughter is at the very beginning of this timeline. Her name is Beatrice, and she's sort of looking off into the distance and so referencing the future and my hopes for her to continue this tradition on for generations to come. But she wrote this amazing poem. So I want to read this poem that she wrote. The title is I Am, a poem by Beatrice. I am Crow Indian. I wonder when I will learn to shawl dance. I hear the sound of the powwow drums. I see my shawl hit my elk tooth dress. I want a unicorn. I am Crow Indian. I pretend I know the next step in grand entry. I feel the beat of the hot summer sun. I touch the elk tooth on my dress. I worry that I will miss a step. I cry when the sun hits my skin. I am Crow Indian. I understand that I can't open the bundle with the rock in it. I say my crow name. I dream about riding a unicorn. I try to be the best I can be. I hope that I can dance forever. I am Crow Indian. Another project that is also inspired by Crow Fair is a piece that I made called Accession Series, which I made in 2019. And this work was inspired by a residency that I did at the Denver Art Museum between 2016 and 2017, and Beatrice was also a part of it. And it was correlated with the Native American Art Department. And the Denver Art Museum has an amazing collection of Crow material objects. And that was one of my interests in working with the institution, was to have the opportunity to look at these objects. So this is some of the collection. There's me with a crow cradle board, and then there are these beautiful beaded blanket strips. And if you never have had the opportunity to go into the underbelly of an institution and see where they house their collections, it's quite incredible. It's pretty remarkable. And it's frankly one of the things that I'm super excited to continue doing, is this type of research. So when I was looking at the crow material, the staff showed me some of the accession cards, some of the original accession cards that were housed in this little box. So these are all the crow accession cards. But the amazing thing is, on the back of these original accession cards were these exquisite watercolor drawings of each of the objects. So the Denver Art Museum, during the Works Progress administration, hired local artists in the Denver community to come and draw all of the Native American collection and also the African collection. And so there are these amazing watercolors that depict the objects that are in both those collections. And I became obsessed with these beautiful watercolor drawings. Unfortunately, because the museum really looked at this as a job, they didn't really record who these artists were. So there was that sort of mystery about these cards. And these cards are, 5x7. On the other hand, there was a kind of a sense of jealousy on my part that whoever these artists were, they got to do exactly what I want to do, which was be with my community's objects and get to investigate them in a really intimate way. So I asked the museum if I could have copies of some of these cards. And what I wanted to do was pair them with parade riders that I photographed, I think, in 2017. And through that, I produced this series of work where I provide a context in which these objects are used. And so that's sort of kind of the main feeling I get whenever I have an opportunity to walk through cultural exhibits in museum institutions, is that I realize, just from my experience and where I come from, that the viewer is only getting about maybe 10% of what that object is, because it's missing the context and its use and the environment in which it comes from. So what I would do is I would find parade riders that were utilizing similar objects. So this is a wedding blanket, and this is my father and my daughter, and the wedding blanket is draped over her lap. This is a depiction of a floral beaded belt, and I found this young parade rider, and they were actually using a floral beaded belt for a horse collar, but very similar. Crow men, they wear these gorgeous beaded cuffs, and so this parade rider has a beaded cuff. You sort of have to kind of investigate these images to find the objects. And this is a beaded saddle bag, and you can see it right here. So I produced around 15 images from that resource, and these are some of the prints that are showing at Sargent's Daughter. So speaking of collections, the first time I really kind of did a deep investigation into a museum collection was at the Portland Art Museum. And around this time that I had a solo exhibition there, which was in 2014, there was a lot of talk about cultural appropriation, specifically regarding Native images. And it made me think about how that related to my community. And I thought about a chief of ours named Medicine Crow. And this is Medicine Crow. And pretty much after I left my reservation to attend college at Montana State University in Bozeman, I began to run into these two specific images wherever I went. I would see him on the cover of books in a bookstore. And when I was going to UCLA, I used to go to Whole Foods specifically to buy Honest Tea because his image was on Honest Tea. And so I started thinking about what this meant, like who these commercial entities were and their use of his image, and wondering if they actually knew who he was, that he was a Crow chief and his name was Medicine Crow. And with that sort of simple question, I started to ask myself, well, wait a minute, what happened that day when he sat down to take that photo? And what I learned was that photo was from a delegation trip that happened in 1880. And not only was it Medicine Crow who went on that trip from Montana to Washington, D.C. to sit with the US president at the time, but 5 other Crow chiefs attended. And they attended with their Indian agent and those interpreters in the background. And the reason why they went there was because the US government was trying to put a train through a large tract of our hunting territory. And so they went there to basically fight on behalf of our community and our land base. And the photographer of those portraits is Charles Milton Bell, and this is an image of him. I often find the more that I work with historical photos, I've learned that once you find the photographer, you'll actually find more images relating to that specific event. So once I started to dig into learning about this delegation and what happened, I also started doing research into each individual chief that attended the delegation. And part of that investigation was to look into their clothing. And what I learned was their clothing really represented how they became a chief in Crow culture, or Bajatcha, which is our term for chief, and its literal translation is good man. And so there are 4 things in order to become a chief. And those are to be the first in battle to touch an enemy warrior, snatching a weapon from an enemy in hand-to-hand combat, stealing a horse from within an enemy camp, and leading a successful war party. And each of those certain coups, as we call them, were illustrated in certain objects that the chiefs would wear. So each of the chiefs had individual portraits taken by Charles Milton Bell. And this is an image of Old Crow. And to talk about some of those coups, the ermine, those are those white long things hanging off of his war shirt, represented that he was successful in hand-to-hand combat. Each of the feathers represent a different coup. It could be that he led a successful war party. The ermine that are on his leggings, which are a little bit hard to see, represent that he stole a horse. And so I basically started to draw directly on these images in red pen to sort of like investigate in a very intimate way, and also draw my attention to the clothing and to his facial features, how he might braid his hair, which then brought up various questions. And the other thing I did was I'd write down little notes that I found in my research about each individual. For instance, Old Crow participated in Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1884. Another thing about Old Crow was that he actually attended the very first delegation trip that happened for the Crow community in 1873. So there he is with his wife, Pretty Medicine Pipe. And in the right image, she's on the right side, sitting down, and his wife is sitting in front of him. One note about delegation photos and the history of delegations is that around the turn of the century, many different Native nations were traveling to Washington, D.C. to sit with the president and do negotiations. So it was quite typical of the time. The other thing to note about these photos was this was a period of time where anthropologists were really analyzing people of color by using techniques of measuring their skull to determine race and sort of ideas that pertain to that certain type of ideology. So some of these, I guess I would say these photos sort of represented a type. So each delegation that sat down and took a photo, that would be the type. This is a type of crow. And this is what crows look like. And this is a type of Lakota. So this is Pretty Eagle. And something that I learned within my research is that when he died, his body was actually stolen from its gravesite and then sold, along with several other crow bodies. And his remains ended up in the American Museum of Natural History. And that has recently come up in 2020 of taking down the Theodore Roosevelt sculpture with the slave and the Native person flanked on each side. So his remains were in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City for 72 years. And then the images that you're seeing in the middle and on the right are of the Crow Reservation. And in the 90s, our community was able to bring back his remains, and he is buried underneath that teepee structure there. And it's known as Pretty Eagle Point. And it was something that I didn't know. I knew of Pretty Eagle Point, but I did not know it was from that history that I uncovered from doing this research. This is Two Belly. And doing research on Two Belly, I had an amazing discovery within the Portland Art Museum's Native collection, where they actually have a very, very similar floral style jacket that Two Belly was wearing in that photograph. And we displayed that within the exhibition. So you can see him in the group portrait standing up. And this jacket to me really makes me wish that these photos, if they had the technology to be in color, it gives you a great idea of how vibrant the color would be from their regalia. This is Chief Pleniku, that quote that I read a little bit earlier in the lecture that came from him. And he was our last official chief, and he died in the 1930s. And something that I learned from researching him, I also have a very personal connection to him because he lived in Pryor District, and he donated his land to the state of Montana to create Chief Pleniku State Park. And I actually ran that for about a year. But that park, the idea of that park came from this trip. So they were actually in Washington, D.C. for about 2 months. And while they were there, they did a bunch of side activities. And one of the side activities was a trip to Mount Vernon, which is Washington's estate. And he was so inspired by Mount Vernon that he wanted to recreate a miniature Mount Vernon on the Crow Reservation, which is Chief Pleniku State Park. So the image on the left is Chief Pleniku's log cabin home, and the image on the right is Mount Vernon, Washington's estate. And Chief Pleniku State Park has his gravesite along with some of his family members. There's a visitor center there as well, and acreage that you can walk, along with a lot of his own personal materials and other cultural materials. And alas, the other thing, after being followed around for years, seeing just those two specific images, I was delighted to see that there were other images from that photographic session. So this is Medicine Crow. And some of the things I like to point out with him is that crowmen love to wear hair extensions. And so I've circled the hair extension on the picture on the left. And long hair for crows really represents having power and sort of medicine in that way. So after they returned from that trip, there was a government clerk named Charles H. Barstow. And he had a practice when crows would come to do business. He would provide them with paper if they were waiting to speak to different government officials. And he would ask them to make drawings. And he ended up collecting these drawings. So when Medicine Crow returned back to the reservation, he actually asked Medicine Crow to draw from memory his trip to Washington, D.C. So this particular delegation is quite incredible because there's a lot of documentation, and it's a like firsthand documentation. So this is the US Capitol, especially with what has happened lately with the Capitol. I immediately started thinking about this drawing that Medicine Crow made of the Capitol. And then another sort of interesting note is the way that he really thought about the landscape and the positioning of the Capitol by including the river. Various boats that he saw, different trains. And a part of their way of getting to Washington, D.C. was to take the train. And some of them, that was their first time riding on the train. And then, as I mentioned, the sort of side activities they did, they ended up seeing one of the first circuses in the United States. And Medicine Crow made drawings of those animals. I became very interested in these drawings and also the descriptions or sort of the names that he gave. Some of these animals that did not exist in Crow country. So the peacock, he calls it Wondertail, comes from above. And the writing is all Barstow's writing. So here are some more of those animals. And as I said, I really became obsessed, quite so much so that I wanted to figure out a tangible way to engage with these animals. And I found an advertisement where you could take children's drawings and then submit them to this company that would then turn them into a soft toy. So I decided, why don't I try doing that with Medicine Crow's drawings? And this is what happened. And so I just continued doing that. This is a big snake with legs. And this is a mountain lion or a lion. The dog and man, also known as monkey. And the zebra. And I just love this image because he was doing such an incredible job recalling from memory. And with this animal, he forgot that it had stripes and he gave it dots. So I recently published an article with Shannon Victoria that is in Panorama. So if you're interested in learning more about Apsáalooke delegations to Washington, D.C., it's in the current issue of Panorama. And this show, an iteration of this show is currently on display at MassMocha in their kid space. The show is called Wendy Red Star, Apsáalooke, Children of the Large-Beaked Bird. And the show is geared towards children, and there's also curriculum that a lot of teachers are utilizing. So another amazing thing that happened with that show at the Portland Art Museum was an opportunity to collaborate with my daughter. So within that show, I was trying to come up with a sort of a final piece to finish up the show. And my daughter, I had a lot of images of the delegation photos that I would use to write on and make notes before I finished the final piece. And I gave her some of those, and she started drawing over the top of them. And I thought, this is it, right? This is her taking her own history and interpreting it. And I thought, what better way than to include her perspective as part of the show? It was really about the next generation and them taking in this knowledge. So I asked her if she wanted to participate in the exhibition, and she said yes. So here's her little studio. And she produced 20 drawings of these chiefs. And then on the way to the opening, she asked if she could talk about her work. She was 7 at the time. So I was nervous, but I thought, I can't be a hypocrite and spend all the time talking about my work and not let her talk about her work. So here she is talking about her work, and she also wanted to talk about the circus animals. And this experience, I realized that she has an incredible ability to speak publicly. And I also learned that, what am I doing? I can engage with my daughter. I don't have to separate my art practice from her. And I thought maybe we could continue doing some collaborative work together. So it started with her giving her class a tour of the entire exhibition. And then from there on, we collaborated until she was about 11. We participated together in another show at the Portland Art Museum called Contemporary Native Photographers and the Edward Curtis Legacy. And Edward Curtis was a photographer around the turn of the century who was on a mission to photograph as many tribal nations before we became extinct. He called us the vanishing race. And part of that mission included photographing crows around the early 1900s. And what I learned was that he really focused on the chiefs and the warriors and not so much the men. And since we're a matrilineal society, I wanted to create portraits that focused on that aspect. And so B and I made 4 portraits called Apsáalooke Feminists 1, 2, 3, and 4. The other thing I wanted to show is just the vibrancy of sort of that wanting to see color within those sepia toned images. And here is B giving a tour of the work that we produced in that exhibition. And we did do a residency together at the Denver Art Museum. And for this, B wanted to do a tour that specifically focused on children of some of the works that were in the Denver Art Museum collection. So we set her up with full access to the museum. Here she is with her badge. And then let her just explore the artwork. And she selected different pieces from the Native collection and the Western art collection and produced 3 30-minute tours. And she became so invested in this idea of being a tour guide that she wanted to have a tour guide outfit. So she drew me a drawing of her wearing this outfit, and I sewed her up to the best of my ability, something as close as possible. So here she is in her outfit and engaging with the public. And then there were various activities that she led after the tours. We started to really hit like a very sweet spot in our collaboration, where originally when it started, I would pitch to an institution that I would like to collaborate with my daughter. And then it sort of turned to institutions contacting me to bring us together. And Tang Teaching Museum was one of those institutions that brought us together. And for this exhibition, they have the Four Seasons in their collection. And the Four Seasons was actually a work that I made at UCLA when I was in graduate school. And it's a very important work for me. It's a work that has had a lot of longevity and has opened up so many doors for myself. And when I made this work, it was the first time that I'd ever really kind of questioned an institution. And that questioning came about because I was looking for a Crow connection. And in a twisted way, I knew that I could go to the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles and find Crow material, which I did. I went there. The way it was set up back then, you had to walk through a dinosaur exhibit, and then you entered into the dark rooms of the native exhibits, and I found Crow moccasins. But it was then that I realized that we were sort of set up as the viewers in that institution to place everything in the past, especially extinct dinosaur bones before you go to the native exhibit. And the other thing that really struck me was these dioramas that were really reminiscent of Montana. So I decided to create that experience that I had by making these faux dioramas and then placing myself within them. So for the Tang collaboration, I had basically be like an apprentice and taught her every single thing I did to create the Four Seasons. So she selected a backdrop and selected all the various animals and the different flowers and plants to be included in that. And we set up a diorama. This is her at the very end. So she helped do the install and understood that it is hard work. And then this time around, she was actually the photographer and the subjects were the museum visitors. And so there's sort of a power shift in that she got to be the documenter. And then she told me she wanted to retire. So this is our last collaboration together, which happened in St. Louis at the Pulitzer. And she gave a tour of the exhibits that were on display, which were Ruth Asawa. So here she is. And she's 13 now and just coming into her own. And I look forward to us reconnecting at some point whenever she wants to. This was, I learned so much by working with her and also just learned to let go, which I think was really important for me. So winding up, I'd like to share a couple of upcoming works that are in process right now. One of them is one of my favorite artist residencies called Crow Shadow Institute for the Arts, and it is located on the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon. And excuse me, and it's a printmaking residency. So artists that are brought in get to work with a master printmaker for 2 weeks and basically sign a contract that you will produce work. And I think that's why this residency has been very successful for me. But the other thing that I love about it is that it was founded by James Lavador, who is a member of the Umatilla Nation. And the fact that it is on a reservation, I feel very much at home. And James really had this idea that he wanted to bring the arts to the community and also share his community to outside artists. And it's just a really amazing program. And I've done it 3 times. So I wanted to share some of the summer prints that I made that will be in production in the spring. And working with master printmakers is truly a collaboration, right down to picking out colors. And I basically am the idea person, and the printmaker and the apprentice are basically my hands and creating the prints. And this is a lithograph. So this is a process of putting on some of the photos that are incorporated in this particular lithograph. It's a very precise and tedious process. So I produced, these are just the color trial proofs, and I produced 3 prints, and they were all based on genealogy. I'm very interested in genealogy research. So this is 4 generations. The top corner to the right is my grandmother, and moving across, that's me. And then at the bottom, that's my father, and then my daughter. So there's 4 generations represented in this lithograph. And this is my great-great-grandfather. His name is Dust. And then my great-great-grandma, her dreams are true, also known as Julia Bad Boy. And then what is actually happening right now is a virtual install at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. In this particular exhibition, this is a digital mock-up of what the installation will look like when it's finished, is working with a photographer who originates from Omaha around the turn of the century named Frank Reinhardt. And at 1898, there was the Trans-Mississippi Exposition that happened in Omaha. It was sort of Omaha's attempt at having a World's Fair. And as part of that World's Fair, there was an Indian village, which they called the Indian Congress. And there was a message out to all various reservations to invite delegations from my community to Apache to Iowa to come and attend this exposition and camp at the Indian Congress. And it was an amazing gathering of, I think, 500 Native people all together. And so I'm working specifically with his studio portraits that he took of the Indian Congress. And I have cut all of those out, and we will then display them on these stands, which are modeled after the fruit stands that some of the other exhibits had in their different halls. And the other amazing thing about this exhibition was that Frank Reinhardt made a connection with my community, and actually the next year traveled to my reservation, and the photo in the back is where he went and he photographed. So there will be photographs of those images. So it's sort of this great link, and I'm really excited to see this come together, which it opens at the end of this month. And I will leave it there. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. So I have a few questions here, and if you're in the full screen mode, you might need to exit out of that so that you can enter into the chat. And so I've got a question here from Floor. What is your hope and expectations for the Crow community? How can the involvement and appreciation of your younger generations, including your daughter, positively affect in the future? I would say we're growing up on the reservation, going to public school in Hardin. It was a very racist experience for myself. Crow kids and mixed kids like myself were not given a chance by our teachers, our white teachers. And so there was just like a real sort of low self-esteem and not much hope. And what I would hope for, you know, sometimes I reminisce about if I was a little kid again, and if I just had a teacher who would have taught me about the Crow delegation members, it would have given me some heroes from our own community. In our backyard, we never talked about Crow history. We never talked about the full history of the US. That's not just my history, it's everybody's history. So I think it's so important that the full picture, multiple stories are shown to these younger generations. And for my daughter, I'm just super proud at her age that she knows, she can tell you exactly what her elk tooth dress means. I grew up wearing that dress and I could not tell you what it meant until probably I was in my 20s, because I never ever really thought to ever question it. So yeah, I think that's sort of my hope, is just by uncovering these histories and putting them out there, that these young Indigenous kids of color, and not just everybody, all the kids can see this and have a fuller picture. So I have another picture from Jan. Another question, sorry. Your use of historical and archival materials is so moving. Thank you. How do you see these as being a part of your contemporary art practice? Will you keep using these materials? Right now, that's what I'm hooked on. They're so important to me. They ground me. I had an amazing experience doing a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, where all my great-great-grandparents kept popping up. I think there's over 1,200 Crow objects in that collection at the National Museum of the American Indian, and over 100 objects were directly biologically related to me. And that was incredible because I've never had that experience before with a record going into a collection where I could actually hold an object and say, this is my great-great-grandfather Beartail's object. And just knowing that and having a photo of him was really grounding for me, and sort of kind of gives me a sense of purpose. And I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but it's important in that it helps me kind of anchor myself. So you got to know your past so you can move into the future. So from Susan, I see some quilt pattern imagery in your work. Can you speak a little about that? I'm only right. So I love quilts. I became interested in sewing when my daughter was born. I'm based here in Portland, Oregon, and Portland has an amazing sewing community. There's amazing sewing or fabric shops in town. But growing up, my grandma, she was an excellent seamstress, my crow grandma. And one of the most coveted quilts on the reservation is the Star Quilt. And we have a thing called the giveaway, which is a ceremony where you give gifts away to your clan, uncles, and aunts. And one of the prize gifts to give away would be a Star Quilt. So I grew up knowing like that was a very valuable item. And the way that I utilize that image in my work is really kind of to honor. So I tend to use it as a backdrop to honor photos of my family. So that's where it kind of comes to play. It's like something that I know is highly prized in the community and a way for me to sort of really kind of honor the subject in the work. I see Amy. Do you work with your older relatives if they are still alive? I do. It might not be like they might not show up in my work, but I'm constantly calling back home all the time. There's a connection to my dad that I'm constantly calling him. And then I feel like just even the delegation work, it's all intergenerational work to me, working with the ancestors. I feel like it's collaborative in nature, learning about them, working with my daughter is intergenerational. So to me, it's all sort of intergenerational work. Meg, I am curious if when researching genealogy, you hit any dead ends. Were unable to uncover history about who you were looking for. If so, how did this affect you or your work? So just started doing some genealogy work, and that all stemmed from my Smithsonian research fellowship. And that's because when I was there, as I mentioned, I found out that there are actual objects that I'm biologically related to, and some of those are ceremonial objects. And I was told that I could potentially get some of those back. And they told me the process of repatriating those objects. And one of the ways to prove that I have a connection to those is through genealogy. And one of their verification is using ancestry.com, which I thought was kind of funny. And I sort of was very suspicious of ancestry.com. I still sort of am suspicious of them. So I signed up for ancestry.com. And I thought, especially on my crow side, that I would only get back to like my great grandparents. But it's actually been quite incredible. And I've been able to get to like a fourth generation. Census records are amazing. So a lot of the census records, marriage records, and death records have come up through using ancestry.com. But the thing that I find that is harder for me with the genealogy is more in relation to some of the cultural knowledge that's lost. Not necessarily some of the people that I can't find. It's more some of the objects that I was confronted with in the collections that I've never seen us use on a reservation, that I would never, if I saw it, never in a million years would I ever associate that object as being Crow. And then showing those to my family and them just being so surprised. And that's when you kind of feel a moment of sorrow, because you know you can't get that information. It's just gone. And yeah, there's just, you just kind of have to mourn that. So Priscilla, you said that your daughter currently isn't collaborating with you, and that's because she is 13. Is she working on a project herself? Does she want to follow in your footsteps of being an artist? Beatrice is amazing. When she turned 11, she told me she's retiring. So she was just finished, and she's sort of awesome in that way. So she's like, I'm done. And she just wanted to just be finished, and I'm looking forward to and I'm open to it if she ever wants to collaborate. We are going to do a piece together for a show happening at the Cleveland Art Museum. But she did have a podcast for a while called Bees, BEA''S, Big Laughs. She'll be mad that I told you that. It's a comedy podcast, a feminist comedy podcast, where she interviews different comedians. But around the time she retired, she said she's going into some sort of corporate industry. But I think deep down she's an artist. I really do. But I'm just along for the ride. I'm excited for whatever she does. I'm excited to support her, and I look forward to her reflections on the work that we did during that time period. Susan B., thank you for sharing in this beautiful presentation. Do you have any books or a website? I have a very poor website. That's just my name. I share a lot of my stuff on Instagram. I do a lot of sort of sharing of installing exhibitions, or sometimes when I go in collections, I'll share the process of that. So that's a great place for updates. And I do have a monograph from the Newark Museum called A Scratch on the Earth. I think it might be available on their website. I think I'm going to say your name wrong, but I had an amazing studio visit, Saj, yesterday with you, and I'm still thinking about your work. Have you dealt with institutions or individuals denying your sources of research or framed information as non-credible? If so, can you elaborate on how and how you experience that? You know, individuals, I have, yes. Institutions, not yet. And yeah, I've had it in the case of the both of them on historical figures. One on Chief Pleniku, who I messed up. I said Chief Pretty Eagle in the quote in the beginning, but it's Chief Pleniku. He was our last official chief. He died in the 1930s, and he has the state park, Chief Pleniku State Park. And so I feel like a lot of people outside of the community, like a lot of non-Crows, look at him as just sort of like a figure, like a kind of a golden figure. And in the community, especially in Pryor, where I grew up and where his park is, we have a more complicated picture of him. And so on his portrait, I wrote sort of some more complicated stuff about him, about how he sold our land and did some sketchy stuff. And that happened to be published in a magazine, and the editor wrote me and said, I normally don't write people, share comments, but this guy was really upset about what you wrote and wanted you to share, explain, where you got that. And I actually got that directly out of the newspaper, what I had written about Chief Pleniku. And so I just kind of, for me, I think I just sort of shattered his vision of Chief Pleniku. I think he wasn't really ready for sort of that, the different versions of a person. But I don't know. I think for me, it's really important that people not to really take that on. That work I already did a lot of the work, and I would hope that people, when they are looking at it, that then it prompts them to go and start doing some work on their own. So that's my hope. But yeah, that's one of the cases where that happened, but an institution, not yet. Joe, I think you mentioned how aspects of creating art are precise and tedious. How do you deal with the tedium that can come with accomplishing your vision, such as with your lithograph? I would constantly like to challenge myself in doing things that are new. And I also love to live sort of like in ignorance is bliss. And so I'll do something that I know nothing about. And then once I'm done making it, I'll say to myself, I'll never do that again. Like that timeline, cutting all those things out, or sewing star quilts, or I once made 7 suits. I've never made a suit before. And I'm like, I will never do that again. So I think just challenge myself to do the unknown, and not knowing what I'm getting myself into. And then I think once I do it, I'm like, I won't do that again. But yeah, I think that's kind of what keeps me going. Sorry, I'm just digesting some of these questions. Okay, this is Delia. For someone who was born in Montana and raised in Idaho and Colorado, and wanting to write about their ancestors seizing land, how would you hope the request for forgiveness and learning begins? I think you just got to do the research and tell everything, even if it's ugly. I think that's where you should begin. That's where I would start. Georgina, how do you heal from some of the research you uncovered? That's a really good question. There's a lot of trauma that I have to contend with in the work that I do. But I think what gets me through it is that I just think about how resilient we are, and how, yeah, just the resiliency keeps me going. I just think about that. I mean, that's like so powerful. that I tend to, that's the line that I kind of like traces through all of my work that keeps me strong and keeps me going. That's kind of like the hero at the end of the day that I really like to focus on. But yeah, it takes a lot of work to kind of look at the history and see it and read some of the things that I read. They're not happy. They're not happy stories. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of gifts that are in there. There's a lot of gifts, and then I also feel like there's a lot of things waiting for me. And then I'm just so happy that I was able to get through that and be able to witness and experience some of those gifts. Okay, it's Tessie, are you planning on collaboration with other Crow groups or other Native American nations? The Congress in Omaha was incredible. Yeah, for now, I think I'm really interested in this Indian Congress. I typically, just focus on my community because it's so complex. And I just really want to be respectful and careful. There's so much about my own community that I don't know, that it's daunting to think about another community. So I think it would have to be in collaboration. But I think the Indian Congress is one of those works that would be perfect to have that show travel, especially travel to a place where one of the delegations is from, and invite people from the community to tell us more about some of the delegates who attended that event. So I think there's a lot. I think that particular project I'm very excited about. I think it's just like the beginning, and I think there's so many people who will be able to utilize it for their own research and collaboration. That's my hope, definitely, for that one. Tessie, I'm not sure. Let me see. Can there be another chief redefined by other acts of bravery or leadership? To my knowledge, it's just those four things, and they're pretty hard to do. And I mean, the things that I stated are they're black and white in statement, but they're hard to achieve. Otherwise, like, all the Crow men would be chiefs. There's a great story about this scout named Two Leggings. It's a book you can read, and he never reached chiefdom. And it's a wonderful book because it really talks about like him trying his whole life to reach chief status, and he never does. And I really like that because I think there's such a focus on like Native chiefs and warriors. And so it's kind of nice to have this really humanizing story about not reaching that certain status. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but there's a question about, I was wondering if you explored the genealogy of your mother's side. Yes, my mom, she is of Irish descent, Irish and Scottish descent, and we actually have a lot of her genealogy mapped out to, I think, 9th great grandparent, which is really cool. And a lot of my family on the Irish side has traveled to Ireland. I haven't. I would love to do that. yes, that's some territory that I have not explored, but I'm not counting it out. And then this is a last question I've got by Sarah Kay. I learned about you and the Four Seasons in one of my classes. Did you make it with the intent of critiquing the museum institution? Do you consider your other work institutional critique? Yeah, I made that when I was really young. I made that at UCLA as a graduate student. And, you know, I went to the Natural History Museum because I was lonely. I was, this was really kind of my first time being away from Montana, being away from my community. And at the time, I wasn't even thinking that it was like unnatural or a messed up thing, but I knew like I could go to the Natural History Museum and I could probably find crow material. And it wasn't until years later that I was like, that's actually really messed up, you know, like, and I don't know if you could place yourself in my shoes and think about like, if you grew up in like a tight-knit place or community and you're really missing that community, and you knew like you could go to a museum and they would have like your grandmother or great grandmother's shoes there. Like that's kind of messed up, right? And so yeah, so it was really kind of out of instinct that I made that piece, because I was really kind of grappling with those feelings. And I think going to UCLA, going to learning so much about contemporary art in that time period, we were really like critiquing the institution. And so I think that was like kind of the perfect breeding ground that produced that work. And then interestingly enough, around 2016, that work really kind of exploded for me, where it was shown a lot in different shows. And it really had a place kind of in the institution as a missing voice for the institution. And it's still like, it's just got a long longevity. I feel like it's its own entity, and it came out of UCLA. So it's just been kind of incredible to be here giving this lecture, speaking with UCLA grad students. As a past grad student, it's all coming kind of full circle. So it's been incredible. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to learn more about my work. I really appreciate it. So thank you and have a good evening.